So grab a coffee and settle in. If you've been working in infrastructure for a few years now, maybe you've stood up a Kubernetes cluster, deployed Vault, or written your fair share of Ansible playbooks, you've probably felt it. It's this vague, creeping unease. Just a quiet little voice in the back of your head asking, hey, if everything literally burned to the ground right now, could I actually rebuild this whole thing from scratch? Well, I'm an infrastructure engineer with about 15 years of scars, and I'm here to tell you, you are absolutely not crazy for feeling that way. In this explainer today, we're skipping all the vendor marketing. No buzzwords, we're just going to sit down SRE to SRE and talk about the raw operational reality of how real companies solve the trust problem. We're diving into what's known as the Bootstrap Conundrum.
But before we get into the solutions, we kind of need to talk about the nightmare scenario, right? Because to really understand this problem, you have to feel the pain of getting it wrong. Let's look back at the infamous GitLab outage in 2017. Someone accidentally deleted the primary database directory. No big deal, right? Just restore from backed up. Well, GitLab actually had 5 different backup mechanisms in place, and when they finally needed them, absolutely none of them worked. The PG dump failed silently, the alert emails got rejected, and those LVM snapshots, they were never actually enabled in the first place. They ended up losing 6 hours of live production data, and it took them 18 excruciating hours to recover over a throttled disk. The lesson here is visceral, and it's one we just have to etch into our minds. Untested backups are not backups. They are literally just stories you tell yourself about backups.
And that brings us to the core mental model of this entire explainer. This is the exact lens we're going to use to navigate everything else today. Infrastructure bootstrap is not an event. It is a permanent debt. The discipline of operating production systems is recognizing the bootstrap moments, treating the high-cost ones with ceremony, automating around the low-cost ones, and refusing to mix 3 things that must stay separate: identity, data, and configuration. This isn't just some theory, guys. This is the raw reality of operating systems at scale.
All right, section 1, the bootstrap problem. Let's get into why day 2 is forever.
So when you operate a production fleet, you quickly realize that your running state is just hiding continuous configuration drift. Day 2 is forever. And that friction you feel when you're trying to set up a system that literally requires itself to already be running, that is the bootstrap problem. It usually looks exactly like an infinite loop. Just imagine you have a fleet of servers. Step 1, your workload needs to authenticate to your secret manager. Let's just call it Vault to fetch its secrets. But step 2, Vault needs to be authenticated to via a credential that the workload holds. So step 3, where do you store that credential? Well, you want it to be secure, right? So you store it in Vault. And boom, right there, you are trapped. The workload needs to authenticate to Vault before it can fetch the credential it needs to authenticate to Vault. It's a massive trust dependency cycle, and it's a loop that dates all the way back to Ken Thompson's famous 1984 paper on trusting trust. Now, the industry actually has a specific name for the key to breaking this vicious cycle. We call it Secret Zero. It's the initial, fundamental bootstrap credential that a workload needs to fetch all of its other credentials. And what's really fascinating here is that no matter how incredibly complex your architecture gets, whether you're running Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, HashiCorp Vault, whatever, every single cycle is broken in exactly the same way. An operator, an actual human being, hand injects the absolute minimum amount of trust at the smallest possible scope just to kickstart the system, and then immediately reduces their privilege. You inject the secret, the system boots up, and then you step back. That is the discipline.
Okay, moving on to section 2, the 3 buckets. This is where we break down identity, data, and config.
So if we know that we have to hand inject trust, how do we do it without creating a completely tangled mess? Well, you have to ruthlessly separate your infrastructure into 3 distinct buckets. First up is the red bucket, and this is identity. These are your root keys, your unsealed shards, your operator credentials. They live completely offline. We're talking hardware tokens or literally printed papers sitting in a safe. And they survive disasters through N of M redundancy. That just means you split a key into, say, 5 pieces and require 3 actual humans to come together to rebuild it. Second is the blue bucket, which is data. This is the actual state of your system, the secrets inside your vault, your database rows. These live in backups. And as we just learned from GitLab, they only survive through tested snapshots stored in a completely different blast radius. Finally, the green bucket, config. These are your policies, your roles, your firewall rules. They live in code, usually a Git repository. And they survive because you can just run an idempotent clone and reapply them to a fresh environment anytime.
Now, the absolute golden rule that makes recovery possible is this: never, ever let 2 buckets mix. Let me give you a really vivid anti-pattern of what happens when they do. Say a developer decides to take a shortcut for an easy setup. They grab an app role secret ID, which absolutely belongs in the offline red identity bucket, and they just commit it straight into their Git repository, which is the green config bucket. Honestly, it feels great in the moment. The automation works perfectly, but it results in a hard recovery because you just gave literally everyone who has read access to your code repository total unhindered access to your vault. You mixed identity into config. Every single time you take a shortcut across these bucket lines, you're basically just setting a timer for a massive future incident.
Let's look at Section 3, how the industry survives. Time for some real-world practices.
So the theory makes total sense, but what does this actually look like in the wild? Well, for brilliantly illustrating identity discipline, look no further than the ICANN DNSSEC root key ceremony. This is the literal gold standard. To manage the root keys of the entire internet, they absolutely do not rely on automation. Weeks prior to the event, they pre-publish a script. On the day of, they gather a 3 of 7 human quorum of completely unaffiliated crypto officers, all in a highly secure room. During the event, they read the script aloud verbatim on a public live stream. And afterwards, they retain the video and the paper audit logs for 10 full years. This proves that for the absolute highest stakes Bootstrap moments, you do not automate. You use ceremony. You make it slow, you make it deliberate, and you make it entirely human.
Next up, let's look at the blue data bucket. And for this, there's a legendary game day at Stripe. On a totally planned Tuesday afternoon, they deliberately issued a kill9 command on their Redis primary node. So what happened? Well, they actually lost all their data. It turns out a configuration change that was made just the day prior was completely incompatible with their snapshotting, and the failover just utterly broke. But here is the crucial takeaway. They were incredibly grateful it happened. They uncovered this massive, catastrophic configuration flaw at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, while all their engineers were heavily caffeinated and at their desks, rather than discovering it at 3 a.m. on a Sunday during a real, unplanned outage. Finally, let's talk about the green config bucket and how you should operate it. For that, we look at Google's DIRT, which stands for Disaster and Recovery Testing. This is a massive annual company-wide drill where they test highly disruptive scenarios. But honestly, the most important part of this is their explicit rule to exclude the system experts. Think about that. If you wrote the system, they literally pretend you are on a plane with no Wi-Fi. The SREs who are left behind have to use the runbooks and the configuration code to recover the system on their own. If they can't do it without you, then your config isn't actually config. It's just tribal knowledge trapped in your head, and that makes you a single point of failure. Section 4, your Monday morning playbook. Here are some concrete next steps for you. All right, we've covered the theory and we've looked at how the industry titans do it. Now let's bring this all down to earth with 3 concrete, zero-budget tasks that you can literally take back to your team this week. Step 1, run a tabletop drill. Sit your team down and just ask, hey, if we lost our vault data right now, what is our exact recovery procedure? Make someone read the runbook out loud. I promise you will find a gap. Someone's going to say, oh, wait, I need to log into the VPN for that, but our VPN authentication goes through Vault. Boom. You just found a circular dependency. Step 2, identify your longest-lived credential and ruthlessly reduce its privilege. If you have some admin token floating around that lives forever, that is a massive risk. Scope it down. Step 3, treat your operator-only runbooks as code. Put them in Git, review them via pull requests, and then, I mean this literally, print them out as PDFs. Keep them on a USB drive or in a physical binder on your desk. Because if your digital infrastructure burns down, you cannot rely on a digital wiki to tell you how to rebuild it. Which brings us right back to where we started. I'm going to leave you with this mental framework one last time because it is just that absolutely crucial to internalize. Infrastructure bootstrapping is not an event. It is a permanent debt. The discipline of operating production systems is recognizing the bootstrap moments, treating the high-cost ones with ceremony, automating around the low-cost ones, and refusing to mix 3 things that must stay separate: identity, data, and configuration. Listen, just start small. Pick 1 bucket to clean up this quarter. Run 1 tabletop drill. Accept the fact that day 2 is forever, and start treating your bootstrap as the permanent operational discipline it truly is. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today. I want to leave you with this one thought. If your entire data center burned down today, are you absolutely certain you have a working recovery plan, or are you just relying on a digital wiki that you'd no longer have access to?